Huh. I have the list of names today. And with that, we have three people who are going to take this entire fest in their hand now. So the very first person I want to talk about would be, any guesses? We are going forward with? Do we have any? Okay, as we don't. So with the very first person I want to take the name is the Gurucharan Das. He's an author, a commentator, and a former CEO of Procter and Gamble India. Now with that, sabse badi baat, this person, he took the early retirement just for the sake of passion and to become a full-time writer. Welcome, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, so okay, before that, taking this name, which is a very tongue-twisted name, it is, okay, I'm sorry already, because I took the entire night to learn the pronunciation of your name. Let's guys welcome John. Anyway, no. I want the pronunciation from the audience. Guys, what's his entire name? Anybody? See, he is the only one who knows. Let's welcome John Zubrzycki. Please, sir. So, about him, he is the Australian author. He wrote 6 books on India. And most recently, if I talk about, is The Dethroned. And about this book, it's the Patel, Menon, and the integration of princely India. His early books include The Shortest History of India and The House of Jaipur. And can I tell you something? I just love the covers of your book. Before talking about the content, I think they are the most beautiful, and he gave a lot of time on that. Now, not with that, he's the PhD in Indian history. And we have a third person with us. Now, I'm always scared of the professors, but we always have a very amazing professors. Professor Ali Khan Mahmudabad. Please guys, he teaches political science and history at Ashoka University in India. In particular, he focuses on matter of religious identity, democracy, culture, literature, and politics of both South Asia and the Middle East. Okay, so are we all sorted and set? Yeah. So, before that, I just want to thank again the Koshala Literature Fest, and we are here for this amazing Princely India discussion and the panel. It's all over to you guys.
Thank you. Now you are the two experts, and I'm going to try and moderate you both, not moderate the session, but moderate you both, and make sure you behave properly. But really, I think it's appropriate. We are in Lucknow, and a city really defined by culture. And just in the last few years, I've been reading or trying to explore the differences between India and China. The average person, the Aam Aadmi in China was defined by the state. And the average individual in India was defined by society. This is what I have concluded. And so India's history was a history of kingdoms, competing kingdoms, principalities, princely states. Right through history, we had 4 empires, mostly short-lived, and they never fully covered the whole of India as it is today. You had the Maurya, the Gupta, the Mughal, and the British. And none of these was as strong as some of the strong Chinese empires. So China's history is a history of empires. And I'm coming to how this is all relevant to us here today. So basically the point I'm making is China had a strong state and a weak society. India had a weak state and a strong society. And in China, the emperor gave the law and then he interpreted the law. In India, dharma, the law, preceded the king, and his duty was to uphold the law for the benefit of the people. In China, the land was owned by the king, and in India, the Arthashastra reminds us that, it reminds the king that he doesn't own the land, he has Shat Bhaga, 1/6, which means a 15% tax rate on the produce of the land, and so on. Anyway, oppression in India, I think, came from society, not from the state. In China, it came from the state. And of course, in 1947, I feel India could only have become a democracy, and China at that time could only have become an autocracy. Anyway, this purpose of India-China really was to get us thinking about the fact when, at a time when the government is trying to remind us that we had this golden state in the past, we never had an India until 1947. And the India that existed was the India of the princely families. Even in 47, there were about 565 families, principalities that were absorbed and became India, mostly without bloodshed. Anyway, the point is, we are a country of principalities and states, and so let's begin, because you are the two experts. Let's begin. Why don't I start with you, since you're from outside, and how do you think of India today versus the work that you've done, the integration of the states, etc. How do you see it all as a professional historian?
Thank you for that introduction, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you to the organizers for bringing me to Lucknow. Let me just set the scene briefly. As Gurcharan mentioned, there were 562, I say 562, other people say 565 states. And these ranged in size from Hyderabad and Kashmir, which had 220,000 square kilometers each, down to micro-states of just a few kilometers square, probably less than the size of this school campus, and certainly a population much less than even that of the student number here. But they were crucial in the lead up to India's independence, the transfer of power, because had it not been for Nehru, Menon, Patel and Mountbatten, had it not been for their ability, their success in coercing and convincing these states to join the Indian Union, decades of nationalist struggle would have gone up in smoke. The Indian states made up 2/5 of India's landmass, and these princes ruled over 1/3 of the population, 100 million people. You could not travel from Delhi to Madras, as it was known in those days, without passing through the territories of one of these states, except for a narrow sliver of land near Jhansi. So you can imagine, and at the time of independence, each of these rulers had the choice of either joining India, joining Pakistan, or becoming independent. As we all know, some rolled the dice, states like Hyderabad, and decided that they would take the independence route. Some, like Junagadh, rolled the dice and decided they would try and accede to Pakistan. There were other states as well that toyed with the idea of either independence or accession to Pakistan, and the list is a long one. What I try to get across in my book is that this was a very messy affair, rather than how the standard narrative that V.P. Menon presents in his book on the integration of the princely states. It was also a rather bloody affair, which runs counter to Patel's famous statement in the Constituent Assembly in 1949 that this had been a bloodless revolution. But between them, particularly thanks to the efforts of Menon and Patel, they did achieve the near impossible. That's why people refer to Patel as the Bismarck of India, for unifying India and creating the country that we have today. So when you look at India 1947, and if you looked at a map, you would have seen this patchwork of yellows and pinks. You know, the pinks being the British ruled, the British Empire, and the yellow being the states. Today, you know, those boundaries, that jigsaw puzzle has been kind of put together, and what you have now is India and its federal system. So I look at India today, and what they achieved is certainly remarkable. Yeah.
Well, I mean, compared to the violence that we've had in the 20th century, the violence of the two world wars, which luckily India escaped, and the later violence that came in say, Mao's China and Pol Pot's Cambodia, etc. I think we've been very lucky, and certainly I believe that India got its independence without shedding an ounce of blood, really, and we were created by saints at the time. Now, my friend Ali, you are a professor of politics, and you are also a representative of one of these amazing states that persisted through history in our country. What's your sort of take on this?
Thank you very much, and nice to see you again, John. Thank you for having me here.
Can you hear him?
Can you hear me clearly? Yes. So John, of course, has written this book, and he could speak to you in much more detail than me about the process of integration. But responding to some of the points you made, so I think it's very difficult to even compare China and India, because I think China's historical experience and the fact that for most of its history, the Middle Kingdom was very resolute in containing outside influence, meant that the development of the Warring States period, so in the BC period all the way up to the Manchu dynasty, the king in the Manchu dynasty, it was not as top down and as we would imagine it. But I think what's remarkable about India, to go back to the first point you're making, is that almost from early history, India is actually a land of confluence.
A land of what?
Of confluence.
Confluence.
Yani Sangam, jisko hum kehte hain. And I think the greatness of India, or the idea of India, because as you said, of course, the India that we know only comes about in 1947 as a political entity. But this idea of India, which has existed for centuries, I mean, Maulana Room wrote about it in his Masnavi, Amir Khusro had this idea of Hindustan. So there was an idea of India. And it was, of course, not defined, and it was not politically defined. But I think what was remarkable about this idea of India was that it represented the confluence of civilizations. And I think that's what really any culture that tries to sort of shut off outside influence, or to search for authenticity, or to create a false sense of authenticity, that kind of civilization or culture ultimately atrophies from the inside. It sort of implodes. And I think one of the, so India as the civilization as well as the country as a sangam is, at least I think as a historian, and if I was to ask to write a political theory about it, I think the idea of confluence can be used to really speak in depth. And so coming to the other points that you made, look, I think the India that we know now is still very much a product of that. You can see it in the languages, you can see it in the architecture, you can see it in the cuisine. This confluence is very visible from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, and from Gujarat to the northeast. And that I think is what has been remarkable. And the princely states, so we were not one of the princely states. My family, where we are from, we are Talukdaris, which are a wholly different entity. They began as basically Talukdaris were revenue collecting officials of the Mughal Empire, and a bit in England, a bit like, I suppose, the barons and the dukes and the landed aristocracy. And even though some of the Talukdaris were vast, as John was saying, that you had principalities which were a few square kilometers, and some of these Talukdaris were bigger than the princely states. But, I think a culture in various parts of India, culture developed, and not enough, I think, has been written about it. Manu wrote that book about Manu Pillai
yes.
Wrote an interesting book. If you haven't read it, I would read it. And John's book, of course.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were going to say something? Or?
No. I was just going to agree with you. I think the mistake people make today is when they try to think back to an India, they think back in terms of a state. It was a civilization, and as you put it very well, a syncretic civilization that absorbed so many influences. Just as it absorbed new deities every day. I mean, with our 330 million gods, and where no god could afford to feel jealous. In fact, when the British came, the missionaries came to India, they, tried to teach people the dharma of Jesus Christ. And the people said, no problem. We'll just make Jesus Christ one of our gods. And what would you like? Would you like him to be an avatar of Vishnu or Shiva? They gave this choice. And so that is sort of idea illustrates also this civilizational. India has been a civilization, but let's not try and think back to a glorious Indian state. And the state, the modern state, is a creation of the 19th century. Basically, this is what we forget. And that state also, had premises of one language, one religion, one ethnicity, and that was a very narrow definition of a state. And I think people today are trying to model themselves on this very narrow conception, whereas the state that we created in our constitution was a much richer idea that would not be based on a single language. In fact, we've learned from the history of Pakistan and Sri Lanka how imposing one language, how much damage that can do. In the case of Pakistan, it created Bangladesh because of language, fundamentally. And Sri Lanka lost a whole generation because of imposing Sinhala. So we made many mistakes in India, but this is not one we have made so far.
But
Anyway.
I would just add that I think it is important, even though the birth of the Indian nation state, and I was in this school when I learned this, was we were taught that it's a peaceful process. But I think at the same time it is important to acknowledge that although, the state did not, I mean, at some level it did, but there was huge bloodshed for those that during the transfer of populations. And those
partition.
During partition. And
Yeah.
I think partition, of course, cannot be separated from the birth of the state. And I think it's very important as a country to confront the trauma of those generations. I mean,
Yeah.
these are people who carry their historical trauma, and the people who
Yeah.
came from
Yeah.
Sindh and from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and from Punjab,
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
people
yeah.
who went. And I think in South Asia, one of the things that we could do really to heal is to actually confront the deep pain and the deep suffering.
No, I must autobiographical note. I've just written a memoir, and in that one of the key sort of stories. I'm 5 years old, and we are in the partition has occurred, and we are in Lahore, and on 17th of August, after Azadi Day, we learn that Lahore has gone to Pakistan, and we are Hindus, so we have to flee for our lives. Luckily, we managed with one suitcase and the clothes on our backs to cross the border. And we feel I can still remember my father and my mother shouting, "We are safe, we are free." And we are next at the railway platform in Jalandhar. And we are waiting for the train to take us to Ambala. And I'm 5 years old, I'm seeing outside the window, there's a handsome, tall policeman guarding the peace. And out of nowhere, two young teenagers, Sikh boys, who come with kirpans, and they murder him. And he falls on the ground. The ground is covered with blood. My mother shuts the window. And as a 5-year-old, this incident is as vivid as anything could be. And why? I kept asking my mother this question. There were two strangers. Why did they kill him? Well, they didn't even know him. And strangers killing each other cheerfully in the name of religion. Because those boys shouted Musalman. That was a Muslim policeman. They shouted Musalman and they killed him. And so, we're not on to that subject, but it was a temporary insanity. Temporary insanity that overtakes people in crowds, overtakes people individually also. And of course you're right, that's something that we must remember. And frankly, I don't think there's going to be a closure to this until we get a great writer like Tolstoy. Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, and he brought closure for the Russian people from the tragedy of the Napoleonic Wars. And similarly, I'm waiting for a Tolstoy of India who will write our own War and Peace and perhaps bring closure.
Ali, that's for you to do, I think. Yeah.
So now, your sense of all this, and
I'd like to just pick up on what Ali was talking about, this confluence of cultures, this syncretism that was such a feature of large periods of Indian history. And now I'm looking at some of the Muslim-ruled states at the time of partition, and I've only just started my research, but what seems to be a feature is that I think in all cases, except for perhaps Rampur, which had a Muslim, it was about a 50-50 Hindu-Muslim, but almost all these states, take Hyderabad for instance, take Junagadh, where you had a Muslim minority ruling over a Hindu majority. For instance, Rampur never had an incident of communal violence in the lead up to independence. Yes, there was some bloodshed when Muslim League agitators sort of took to the streets. Jinnah had been trying very hard to get the Nawab of Rampur to accede to Pakistan and failed, but there was still pressure being coming from the street to change his mind. I've spoken to families of other Muslim-ruled states. In one case, I think it was Kamadia, which is a tiny state in Gujarat, where the Muslim, the proportion of Muslims to the rest of the population was less than 1%. The son of the late Nawab told me that the only Muslims in the state were his immediate family, their retainers, and a few ministers and so on that they brought in to rule the state. But there was complete communal harmony. The family would donate land for Hindu temples, as your family did as well. They would not tax, for instance, the materials that were needed to build these temples. They attended the Hindu festivals. Hindus attended their festivals. And this I'm starting to understand very much was not the exception but the norm. I went to a launch in Jaipur of a book by the Nawab, the erstwhile Nawab of Loharu. He described how in the 19th century the two daughters from Loharu, a Muslim-ruled state, married two daughters of the Maharaja of Alwar, a Hindu-ruled state. They were very close together, strong links between them. This would be almost unheard of these days, unfortunately, in India. But I take Hyderabad. When I was researching my first book on the last Nizam, one of the things I got that was repeatedly told to me was that there was no differentiation between Hindus and Muslims in the state. The only way, of course, the name would be a giveaway, but not the dress. There's a famous incident of Mahbub Ali Khan, who was the sixth Nizam, when the river Musi broke its banks. He went down to the riverbank, donned a sacred thread, sat there with the Brahmin priests to, pray for that there would be no more, that the flood would recede, that there would be no more victims, and so on. So these were very syncretic cultures, and that's something that I think is really worth remembering.
So then, why John and Ali? What explains this temporary insanity, or what do you make that? I remember when we lived in Lahore, it was exactly the same way. Our neighbors were Muslims, our neighbors were Hindus, and you couldn't imagine anything like this at the time. So how do you explain that a whole state goes temporarily insane, ended up killing between 250,000 and 500,000 people?
So I think if we step back a bit, so firstly, it's interesting that both of you used the word confluence, but I did not use the word syncretic.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually don't use the word syncretic, because I think the syncretism that we imagine implies some kind of fusion and dilution, therefore. And I think what was actually amazing, if you go into the history and if you read first-hand accounts and if you read about relations, what was remarkable actually was that people lived in harmony from a place of great and deep devotion. They were deeply rooted in their religions, whether it's Islam or Hinduism or Sikhism. And actually, your question, sir, I think points to the fact that part of the insanity was because the very category of religion, when it became a part of modern political discourse, reduced religion to superficialities, to markers. That depth slowly, and I think more and more so now in the age of social media and so on, religion in a sense is, a large part of it is now performative. It's always been, for sure. But I think those deep roots are what sustained and nurtured this harmony that did exist. And also, let's not forget that whether it's a Hindu ruler or a Sikh ruler or a Muslim ruler, the nature of power is to preserve itself. So I don't think we should ever look at power from the prism of religion, because power is a religion of itself. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about a democracy or if you're talking about an autocracy, or if you're talking about a kingdom or a monarchy. The nature of power and those in power is that they want to keep that power. It's much easier, of course, in pre-modern times for the kings and the princes. And of course, as we were talking about yesterday, John, all of these princely states, especially those which had mixed populations, they simply could not have survived and sustained if there was deep religious tension. Of course, there was discrimination, but what we often read as discrimination was actually the infighting, the factionalism. And as historians, and I remember my supervisor telling me this. He said, "Be very careful when you're in the archive, because don't ask questions of history that are driven by the present. Because you're trying to understand the present, you put on these glasses and go into the archives and search for things that sort of almost try and fulfill what you're looking for. Go and actually see what happened. And it's gray. It's never black and white. It's complicated. And so I think that's the one big thing is that across the board in India and across the world actually, the big transformation that happened in religious communities is that as religion got politicized, it became more superficial. And as it became more superficial, it became more fragile. And as it became more fragile, people's egos became more fragile, because of course there were no more deep roots. And that is partly why, and this is it's very easy for me to sit here and say this, but I think that is partly why you see the kind of, people often say this to me, religion is the cause of the biggest violence in history. It's absolutely not true in the last 2 centuries. It's communism, state fascism, and some forms of nationalism, which have killed the most and ethnic forms. So religion actually, has got a bad rep, and I think this is the thing that we should.
So let me, Ali, let me ask you.
Very good points, Ali. Very good.
Yeah. Let me ask you, how do you, as a historian, as a person who's looked at the paper, how do you come to grips? How do you understand that suddenly people who were living in reasonable harmony one day started killing their neighbors cheerfully in the name of religion?
I don't know if I've got a lot more to add than what Ali said on that score. I think he explained it brilliantly, perfectly. Yeah.
What, temporary insanity?
Temporary insanity, yes. Fed by political leaders, maybe. I think much more so than religious leaders, wouldn't you say? It was something that.
If I may, I think the other thing we forget is from the 19th century to the 20th century, and now more so in the 2023. Imagine suddenly when the telegraph comes and print comes, these communities that have been relatively isolated and have lived together are suddenly waking up and reading news of massacres in some far-off place, and the words used to describe those massacres are religious labels. Often it's much more complicated what's happening in North Africa or the Caucasus or Eastern Europe. And so suddenly the world shrinks through technology. And I think people become insecure. And today, even more so, because of social media, you're suddenly aware of this vast world. And how do you make sense of it? That's not for us, I presume.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to ignore it.
Yeah, but it was also put in those religious terms by the British. that was Mountbatten's primary concern was putting a lid on what he termed communal violence. So I think that was played a large role in it as well. And, fanned by the likes of Muhammad Ali Jinnah too. So and Patel, I have to say, who was very communalist in his politics, particularly in the immediate aftermath of independence, and certainly bring out some of that in the book, in his treatment of Muslim minorities in states such as, his attitude to Muslim minorities in states such as Alwar and Bharatpur.
Yeah. Well, certainly you're right that in the last 200 years, the chief villains of violence have been nationalism, communism, and fascism. And the liberal in me somehow feels that those are the ones that we have won victory over. However, the liberal order today is under siege, and before I sort of before I leave this particular subject, the reality is that in most of Western history, at least, and this is what perhaps makes India unique, that in Western history, religious wars were devastating. They were the chief, probably more people died in religious wars than any wars. And so it's it's worth remembering this. And maybe we were exceptional, and the whole idea of Ashoka's, that Ashoka's one of his pillars, in which he writes that if you something to the effect that if you criticize somebody's religion, you are demeaning your own religion. That was the gist of what he was saying. And Gandhi expressed it in different ways, the same thing. And I feel for us the lesson today is that it's a shame that Gandhi died so soon after independence, because nobody after that has managed to sell the wonderful ideas of our constitution, the modern liberal ideas of Gandhi sold equality and liberty and these values through the language of dharma, and people connected with that. But after that, Nehru was well-meaning, and he tried. He gave many speeches, but he was too much of a Western-oriented gentleman to reach the people. And it does require a bit of myth-making that Gandhi did. This Ishwar Allah Tere Naam, all this was myth-making. And so, personally, I feel that secularism is letting us down today because of this factor that we haven't actually, people still believe that one day the Constitution fell from the sky, from heavens, and they don't think the Constitution is theirs.
Yeah, as it was famously said, it was imposing a liberal constitution on an illiberal society. I can't remember who that said.
Yeah, but I wouldn't have called the society necessarily illiberal.
Mm-hmm.
And Americans sell. I grew up in America, and Americans sell their constitution every day. Every single day in school, you sell the constitution, and that, I think, that is one of the reasons why people feel that for the last 50 years, 75 years since independence, an elite, English-speaking elite, has ruled the country. Even now, all the serious business of this, whether it's in the private sector or of the state, it's done in English. And if a person who doesn't know English walks into, as if somebody walked into this gathering, they would think they're deaf. Imagine feeling deaf in your own country. That is because, English is still 6-7% are fluent, and about 15% are in various degrees of comfort with it. So 85%, imagine if you're one of the 85% in the country, you feel deaf in your own country. And I think that's partly led to this problem that secularism has and the values of the constitution.
So I think you mentioned Gandhiji, and I think what's interesting is that Gandhiji actually proposed an upper house of the Indian princes. Not many people know this. Before 48. And he had this idea that the Indian princes were custodians of India's culture and heritage, and so a bit like the upper house in England. I think, what made Gandhiji remarkable is that he was able to locate the values that you're speaking of within tradition. And he spoke that language. He did not speak an alien language. And I think a lot of these principalities and talukdaris and zamindaris, a lot of these kings and princes and rulers actually realized that all it takes is to be able to speak and hear another language in the deepest sense of the word. And I think that foundation also got shaken because, again, in a deeply religious society, which our country was and is, unless you use the myths, unless you use the symbols, unless you speak through tradition, of course there's going to be an increasing gulf, the elite Gurcharanji that you speak about. But of course it's, my father used to often recite this from the Ramcharitmanas, and often through poetry. And I think poetry is something we haven't spoken of today, but throughout India's history, it's remarkable the work that has been done of joining people together and creating dialogue through poetry, and how poets have actually given us glimpses of the possibilities. And so it says, Kam koh madman na moh, lobh na chobh na rag na droh, jinke kapat mein dam nahi maya, tinke hirde basura ghuraya.
And I think those rewards have been jealously guarded since then, and so this it's a social revolution that's taken place based on resentment.
But you had a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious society, so English was kind of seen as the bridge.
Yes, but at the same time, if we were going to live with English, we should have done a much better job of educating our people in English. This is, even now, the fact that today 7% are fluent has given us huge competitive advantage. It's created the IT revolution and made India a player in the digital world, in all over, we can make India something we should be proud of, and I just wanted to, wanted to ask you a different question, unless you want to comment on what.
No, I was just going to say that actually some of the princely states were doing, they're reduced to caricatures of royals and all of that. The courts and so on, the bejeweled and the bedecked.
Not in my book, though.
Not in your book. But, some of them were doing amazing work. Some of them were patronizing education, building institutions. It was really quite remarkable, the story of how many of the Indian princes were also modernizing.
Exactly,
and actually opening up their societies. Maybe, John, you...
Yeah, well, if you look at India today, think of those states which are doing very well. Karnataka, Mysore, is today in Karnataka. Its ruler, Krishna Rajawadya, he was one of the most enlightened. I think Gandhi called him the Rajya, like the sort of he elevated him to a princely, like almost holy status. Really, he built eye hospitals, he built irrigation works, he set up industries. He was a classically trained musician who was at at ease with a Chopin sonata or a Carnatic Kriti. He set up, the Mysore sandalwood soap factory. I mean, he was a modernizer. He had, and now I think Karnataka is, it has been rewarded. It's reaping the rewards of that enlightened administration. You look at Baroda, another state, which Gujarat being it being in the centre of Gujarat. So that's another example. Travancore was in Kerala, and that was also at the time of independence had 47% literacy, more than much higher than anywhere else in British India. And look at where Kerala is now.
Yeah, and of course we had southern states, princely states in the south as well as the north, and we do have this stark contrast today, where the per capita income of the south is significantly higher than the north, where all the human indicators are superior of the south, whether it's literacy, whether it's mortality. And in fact, it's a problem that's facing, a real problem with the delimitation coming in 2026. I mean, there could be a civil war. I mean, if this thing is not controlled, and and I don't trust the politicians to be able to needs again another Gandhi type of politician. But it's the most. But why is it were the princely states in the south more enlightened in many ways, that that the south has gone way ahead of the north? It's become a different country.
Look again. Hyderabad was another very well-administered state, and look at where Andhra Pradesh is today. Hyderabad being became and Bangalore, both states almost like the Silicon Valleys of India. Look, you don't want to overgeneralize, and I think the reason for the South being more advanced than the northern Indian states are many-fold. Ali, you can probably shed more light on them. I mean, I'm thinking
it's best to
yeah. I think maybe we have just a few more minutes left. So if there's anyone in the audience, I see some hands going up. The lady over there. Let's take a few minutes, and can we give her a mic? Can you take this one?
So it's been a pleasure. I've been here since 1:30. I think stayed here very long to hear all the talks, and congratulations to the organizers for doing this. The crowds could have been larger though, because it was very interesting to be here. And of course, being a long-time student of history, and of course, being older in years, I think something what Ali said, he's a young guy. Maybe sometimes you tend to be more optimistic when you look back at history with young eyes. But I would like to make just one point, is that no one definition of Indian history vis-a-vis its dynasties over the 4 different kinds of rulings or rulers we had. And especially from the eyes of women, I think if you look at it from the eyes of a woman in India, I think we would look at history very differently, and I wouldn't like to go into the details of this. Let us just say that, yes, there are different versions of what's going on, what went on before, but believing in the better angels of our nature, I think we did have a bloodless independence, but things were not so happy in the medieval times and even in the ancient times, and probably that history has not been well documented in India, depending more on Shruti and Smriti. It was more of our oral tradition. So documentation is a little something to worry about in the Indian context. That's the point I wanted to make, but thank you so much. And the last question is, which is a book of Manu Pillai, which Ali referred to. Could you please spell it out? Thank you.
The book?
False Allies is the book I think we're all thinking of. Yeah. False Allies. Yes.
Anyone else?
And of course, there are sort of remarkable instances. The Begums of Bhopal, for instance, and during Mughal times, some of the women who were ruled. I mean, yes, I think the danger also is seeing history as a continuum and having the same expectations of history that we have of our present.
So the Nayars of Kerala are one of the reasons that that the South the Kerala is so far ahead. Anyway, somebody else had his hand up.
I feel all of you are in awe of guy like Gandhi. I don't know why, because what you have tried to show is this, that he was some kind of a secular guy who believed in uniting everyone. But if you read mainly from the British historians, what they say is this, that all that Congress represented were three castes: Brahmins, Kais and Banyas. And all the Congress leaders were only belonging to these castes. But other castes were totally ignored, and they had nothing to do with India of what you are talking about. Like when Dr. Ambedkar, when British gave separate electorate and minority status to SCs, Gandhi went on to a fast unto death. He never went on to fast unto death ever in his life. But suddenly, for what? He wanted to impose his own views on others.
But
one more thing, Gandhi is certainly a guy who was living in South Africa. He comes. Nobody heard of South Africa till cricket team came here. Nobody knew where it was. It is like Antarctica. But then he comes in 1915. He comes to India. In 1916. He comes to Lucknow, he signs his Lucknow Pact, and he represents all Indians. On what basis? He suddenly started representing all Indians, and he had a pact with the Jinnah, who was a Ismaili Khoja, who are almost nil percentage of Muslim population, and they have a pact, and they give 33% reservation to the Muslims. And you are telling us that Gandhi was secular or whatever, liberal or whatever you want to call
Gandhi did. The reality is that our constitution was not created by Gandhi, but the writer was Ambedkar, and he was a representative of the Dalits, and he.
I also belong to Mayawati's caste. I just want to tell you, and I'm also ex-NDA, Navy and Naval Aviation, everything. That's a different issue. But what I'm trying to say is this, please don't call us Dalits. The only in India there are different castes. You could name the caste. That's all. Because Dalits is a political term to certainly address everyone. Like Gandhi used to say, I represent everyone. You can only represent a caste. You can't represent everyone.
Okay.
नहीं देखिए नहीं आप बहुजन समाज के हैं और देखिए अंबेडकर जी को भी you're not from बहुजन समाज okay I thought okay but you were speaking as if you were. The point is what's very interesting also is that for example Ambedkar ji Baba Sahab to come back to the topic of the panel, he actually was he was patronized and given scholarships by the family of Baroda.
Yes.
So again my point is that often if you look at and excavate the history of many of the princely states, they were doing very interesting things. And as far as Gandhiji is concerned, I don't think frankly anyone, no human being should be conceived of as a saint. Everyone has good aspects, everyone has bad aspects. Gandhiji stood for some things that we can agree with, some things that maybe he was completely wrong in. And that is human nature. I think all human beings are complicated human beings. And I think in the very limited way we were speaking about him, we were merely speaking about the fact, whether you like it, you agree, you disagree, is that Gandhiji, unlike a lot of other people, spoke the language of tradition. You can disagree with it, but a lot of other politicians, he was able to give his own definition of Ram Raj. Right? You can disagree with it. Lohia, who was an atheist, Lohia ji, wanted to organize, a festival of Ramayans. He was a Nastik.
Yeah.
But he said you cannot understand India until you understand this.
Correct.
Right? So I don't think we should, all human beings have an aspect to them which you will disagree with. Other human beings, we deify human beings. That's a different matter entirely. But I think,
Yeah. And even Nehru did so much to embed some of our democratic institutions, but he had a big flaw. Of course, it's hard to blame him for that flaw. The fact that he was a Fabian socialist, and what he asked for a society, a socialist society, and the bureaucracy gave him a command economy, and we lost 2 generations of the country. We really got our economic freedom only in 1991. That's 40 years later, but that's another. There was another the lady over there. Yes. Do we not have a mic in the audience at all? Here, why don't you take this?
Yeah, I'll pass the mic on, but I want to say one little thing. Please refrain from expressing your opinions and ask your questions. Thank you.
Good evening.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, all 3 of you. And I wish the audience was larger, and I wish the younger generation was here. So I request the organizers of this festival to go out and try to get the youngsters in. It's very important. And I would just like to, because I'm also a student of history, so I would just like to correct something. I think one of you said that India did not suffer from the World War. But we sent our soldiers, the British
that's a different...
sent our soldiers, and we lost about 25 lakh people in the Second World War. Even in the First World War, there are poignant stories like Usne Kaha Tha, if you might have read
I
it.
said we won our freedom without shedding an ounce of blood. Yes, we did the world wars and all that.
Yes, but you did mention the Second World War, so I would just like you all historians to write about this, the contribution and the losses that we suffered in the Second World War and in the First World War, and
That's
all the wars
correct.
where our soldiers were sent, and the famines that we faced because the resources were used for the Second World War and First World War and all those things. So those should be highlighted as historians.
But there have been many books written on India's losses, the role of Indian soldiers in both world wars, including most recently, I think, one on the siege of Kohima as well. So
They should become popular. They should be popularized. They should be taught in schools. And the other thing, one more point I would like to make about Gandhiji. You said that whatever you said, his contributions and all are, we all acknowledge them, but we cannot conjecture. Had he remained alive, what he would have done, that is just a technical point of history, because we cannot.
You're right.
That's not a fact. And we cannot disregard Nehru's contribution also, even though he was a Fabian socialist or whatever label, because we have seen what has happened to other countries. So he gave us the foundation. And as you know, as everyone knows, as Ali said, that everyone has flaws. So he also had a lot of flaws, but we cannot say if he had not been there, then this would have happened.
I blame actually Indira Gandhi for that much more. And the reason is, as I said, during Nehru's time, everyone was a socialist. The world applauded India. But by the time Indira Gandhi came, let us remember this, that by the time Indira Gandhi came, we had seen the rise of Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong. All these places had risen, and they presented an alternative model of national economic success. That's the only point. Okay, that gentleman, do we have time? This gentleman wants... Yeah. Here, there's a mic behind you.
Sir, about Nehru's socialism and Indira Gandhi's socialism, I've read your book, India Unbound. I would like to say that both were wrong, but Nehru was a socialist by conviction. Indira Gandhi was a socialist by convenience, because it was her route to power and to retain power. That said, so I'll make one other point. So you spoke about a latent north-south divide, because the cow belt north is not doing as well as the southern states, and you are wondering how politicians are going to handle it in future with delimitation and so on. I think the first signs of an emerging north-south divide are already visible in the southern states, asking for devolution of financial allocation from the Finance Commission, commensurate to their contribution to the national kitty. And our Prime Minister is hard put to deal with this issue. I think this issue is coming. The first signs are already visible.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, do we any other questions? If not, I think all of you should applaud. Oh, there is one more question. Young man, there we are.
Oh, thank you so much for your talk.
A little louder.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask, right, because you mentioned that in a lot of contemporary societies or countries, we're moving to a more, I guess, a nationalist or a more religious-based governments. From the history's perspective or your point of view, what resolution do you think has there been for places where there has been a rise of nationalism, or is that what does the future look like from the
I mean, may I just jump in?
Yeah.
So I don't think we should ever take religious guidance from politicians. That's the very basic thing. And if you look at the three people who used, rightly sir, aapne shayad ye baat kahi thi, the three people who are associated with using religion for political ideologies, in Zionism, a form of political Islam, and Hindutva. So Theodor Herzl, who wrote this book, the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and Jinnah, and Savarkar, they were all non-practicing non-believers. Some were atheists, self-professed, and they were agnostic. They had actually very little time for religion, you know. And that's, I mean, this in itself speaks volumes, that how people who want to use religion for political ends often have very little time for the deep, the spiritual messages that emanate.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing, is what I spoke about earlier, is, you know, religion in its superficial aspects will always be easy to manipulate. And I think, you know, cultivating and then sustaining communities that have deeper roots, that is one very clear way of countering this.
And you know, the young man, you asked also about why is it suddenly in the world illiberalism is growing. We have one country after country becoming an illiberal democracy, beginning with the oldest United States. And this is this is a real question. And how long is this? Are we sort of condemned to this period where liberalism is under siege? I mean, I don't know if we have, anyone has any answer. Why suddenly democracies are going through this? But as far as nationalism is concerned, we should not just totally dismiss it, because there are two kinds of nationalism. George Orwell made a very good distinction around the Second World War. He distinguished between good nationalism and bad nationalism, whereas the good nationalism is my memories of my childhood, which bring me back to a place, the geography of the country, the Himalayas and all, and so on. The bad nationalism is about power, and that is a very toxic form of nationalism. And so we must always be wary, and we've certainly learned the lesson from the 20th century is that both world wars were nationalism-led wars. Yeah, I think we have run out of time. You're absolutely right. So thank you all very much. Sorry? Okay, thanks. No, I think we have come to the end of our, and you know, we've tried your patience a bit. And so please applaud these two distinguished panelists of mine, and thank you for listening to us patiently.
Thank you. Now the mic. Thank you. Check. Let me have the. Check. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to all three of you. Thank you so very much. It was interesting, intriguing. Please put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen, for the three gentlemen here, Gurcharan Das, John Zubrzycki, and Ali Mahmudabad. And I'd like to call on the stage Mr. Amitabh Singh Baghel. If you could please come on the dais and do the honors. Let's felicitate our three panelists. It was a wonderful session, and it really, really was intriguing. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Amitabh.
I'll just say I hope the mic does not play up again. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Gurcharan Das, John Zubrzycki, and Ali Mahmudabad being felicitated by Mr. Amitabh Singh Baghel, the Festival Director of Koshala Literature Festival. Please, do not hesitate. Right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the second edition of the Koshala Literature Festival, and we have a wonderful evening planned for you. Let's hear it one more time for our speakers here, Gurcharan Das, John Zubrzycki, and Ali Mahmudabad. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, please put your hands together. Yeah, one for the album.